It's the day after Halloween. I did not trick or treat last night. I watched the Patriots beat the Chargers. But today we're not here to talk about that. We are here to talk about something pretty serious. I've got a guest from New York City. Her name is Janice Lintz. Janice has done so many things in her life. I would say the most notable is her whole commitment to hearing accessibility and helping people that are suffering from hearing loss actually be heard, and breaking the silence in that whole arena. She's spoken, and I think she's visited up to 194 countries around the world, and she's impacted companies and associations all around the world, like Capital One, Delta Airlines, the City of New York, the Pentagon, the NFL, and making them aware of how important it is to make hearing accessible to those who are living without hearing. But over and above that, she has done a tremendous amount of work and a frustrating amount of work trying to deal with domestic violence and all the corruption and conflicts of interest associated with domestic violence. So we're going to try to bridge the gap between these two stories. And I'll do my best to navigate this with Janice's help. So Janice, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, David, so much for having me. And just to clarify, it's 194 countries, territories, and unrecognized nations, 139 UN countries. I don't want to overcommit to something that I haven't accomplished yet.
Okay, well, 139 countries is pretty significant. And I think I've been to 5, so you've got me beat. All right, Janice, we just talked before I hit the record button, and there's so much that I would like to cover with you, and I want to do so thoughtfully. This is not a topic that I've covered before, specific, either of them, the hearing initiative, but also the domestic violence initiative. And I kind of want you to help guide me, but I believe that one has fueled the other for you in your life. But why don't we just start with, first of all, why the commitment? Where did this all come from on the hearing loss side? And then maybe we can dive into the domestic violence piece and talk about how they work together.
Well, I have a daughter, and when she was diagnosed with hearing loss at age 2.5, the doctor immediately after diagnosing her said that there were special schools for her. The doctor's idea of special schools and my idea of special schools were very different. And I didn't understand why her entire life just dropped because of a diagnosis. And I was unwilling to accept that. So I felt it was easier to change the world than to change my standard. And my daughter ultimately did. She went to a top girls' school in New York City. She went to one Ivy League, and she's now getting her master's in another Ivy League. And that's what I set about doing. I didn't really know what I was going to do or how to do it or where it would go, but I thought I would start. And I didn't know what she needed. Discovering what she needed was when I traveled, because I traveled so extensively. I would see access in other countries, or I would see ear symbols, and I would ask questions. What is this? How does it work? And then I didn't understand why it wasn't in the United States. And then what I didn't understand is that nobody seemed to be paying attention to the topic, and that it would be in sporadic places. Many times it didn't work. At Gettysburg Park, it was broken for 6 months and no one bothered to fix it. There was everybody had a myriad of excuses. And that's what I found out, is the lack of access was due to a myriad of excuses and laziness by people who didn't care. And I was going to make them care. And it wasn't just this one park, it was everywhere we went.
What was your initial message, though? This is such a major, it sounds like a simple ask, but it's a major ask, given that it had been somewhat ignored, right? Or it wasn't a priority. So how do you ask that question and get people to pay attention to it?
You go to the top. I realized that very early on, that going through, quote, visitor services or the education department in a museum, that person didn't have the funds, the authority, they didn't have the checkbook, and that was a waste of time. And I learned that at the museum of the New York Historical Society, where they took a very different approach. They brought the team in, from the curator to the COO to the director to visitor services, all in one meeting. That was the first meeting I had sat at where an entire team was brought in. And I quickly realized, oh my God, this is exactly what you need. You need a team where everyone's on the same page, right? And it's going around the table. And the most important person at that meeting was the person with the checkbook. And when she said yes, it was done. The New York Historical Society became the first museum in New York City to add full access. And it became a model of excellence. And suddenly all the other museums went there to visit.
I've trained like thousands of salespeople in my life. And that's probably one of the top 2 or 3 problems that they have is they enter through the wrong door and they settle for the wrong audience and they don't have the right people in the room. And then they waste lots of time not closing stuff. So if you want to get into sales at some point, you probably should, because you know exactly how to navigate the process. Was that an early win?
I would say it was like a couple years into the process, but I was still getting my sea legs. I knew nothing about hearing loss. I knew nothing about how to work within this environment. I had never been made this type of change before in anything in my life. So I was using, this was a learning experience. I had to cut my teeth and I was making, mistakes or not doing it correctly. And I was like doing this in the dark. So I had to figure out everything and reinvent wheels and reach out to people. I didn't even know who the people were to communicate because I didn't know anyone who was a change agent or a leader in advocacy.
Where do you take the first step when you don't know? Again, I could apply this to any business where I don't know these people, or I don't have a network yet, or I don't know how to get an audience with this C-level, whatever. So they don't act. They don't even take that first step.
So it's interesting. Before I went to law school, I worked in advertising and I was a media planner for a large ad agency, Bozell. But my job was to learn industry, was to gather the information, sift through all of it, figure out what the kernels were that I felt were relevant, and then synthesize it into a paper. So I had that background and took the same approach because frankly, I didn't know what else to do. So I spent 6 months researching hearing access, reaching out to whoever I thought the leaders were, whoever someone recommended. One person recommends one person. I followed up on every lead. It was tedious and I felt like I was never going to understand this full. So I tried to find an area where no one was working on that was important to me, and then become the leader or the subject matter expert for areas that were unattended to, that were causing problems in my life. In the beginning, this was all about my daughter, right? Like, how do we solve problems for our family? It never occurred to me that this would be a global issue, that I would be changing access for globally 360 million people. That never even entered my brain. This was, how does our family function to go to the museum on Saturday? I would follow up. I would send thank yous. I used the same business techniques that I learned when I worked for Bozell. Professionalism. I found out a lot of people in the disability world didn't use that. And they didn't dress in business attire to go to meetings. They came in, loungewear. If I'm going to meet a senator, they're going to want to talk to me because they view me as serious about this. I'm not wasting their time.
Did you ever feel like you were going crazy though, at some level, that you're telling a story that no one else was even considering? And as you started to pay attention to this hearing loss, once you made it your priority, I mean, I would think that once you started to uncover things, oh my God, there's even more things that need to be uncovered. How do you keep your sanity through that process?
I'm super organized. So first is keeping, I have phone logs to keep track of everything. And I can see patterns. Bozell trained me really well. And I had great bosses who trained me really well in looking for opportunities in the market and connecting dots. I saw things that other people didn't see. And so a perfect example is the project of the photo behind me of the taxis. Now, I saw this in London. I didn't know how it would work. The driver who wore a hearing aid explained it to me. I realized suddenly this was not only the benefit for the passenger, but also the driver for retention of employment. And I thought, why isn't that in the United States? I remember testifying before the National Park Service and being told, no, the head of a major hearing loss organization, it won't happen. And I was like, if you don't ask, it doesn't happen. I did. It happened. And in fact, more than I ever expected, because I helped to write the guidelines. But over and over, I mean, last week, the FDA just announced this new proposed over-the-counter rule. I called out the major hearing loss organization during my testimony. That was a very bold move. And I have learned not to mince words, because otherwise you waste way too much time by not discussing what's really going on here. You get to the root of the problem. And I was terrified, beyond terrified. I was putting my neck on the chopping block, and I was right to do it. I was right to discuss the issues of we need transparency and accountability on the features, and we need testing. And that is exactly what the new ruling is is proposing. I was the only person who testified as a consumer who was not paid by a hearing aid company to be there. I funded my transportation, my hotel out of my own pocket. I took risks that other people were unwilling to take.
How would you rate your success or progress with this initiative, looking back on it?
I definitely accomplished way more than I ever would have. This recent over-the-counter proposed rule, I think, is definitely one of my most significant achievements, to disrupt a 5-company hearing aid oligopoly, and drive the prices down and bring transparency and accountability to hearing aids. I'm really super proud of that. Did I ever think when I started with, the first museum, I'd be where I am today? Absolutely not. It never even occurred. Like, I was just literally looking one step ahead of where I was. And then there was this turning point. And I remember it was involved 2 people who are deceased now, but, a former, I think his title was Deputy Director of Human Rights. They did an intervention, and they said that they didn't think I was acknowledging the successes I had made. And I was always on to the next project, but I was so tunnel visioned in accomplishing this. I started doing this for my daughter. I am now doing this because when people come up to me where the access has benefited them and they are so happy, and then they send me an email or they tell me in person the benefits, there's nothing better. There is nothing better in life. It is the ultimate high. Yeah. And that's what drives me. I realize that for whatever reason, this is my purpose. And I am really lucky that I love what I do. And my daughter has immensely benefited, I think, not only from the actual access, but from realizing she doesn't have to accept crumbs. And my goal was to raise children who realized they could go for the brass ring and go after their dreams, whatever it is. Because when they watch people defy the odds and accomplish what people say can't be done, no, it can't be done because no one tried or no one thought about it.
Okay, so let's also talk about what else might have contributed to fueling you through this process. And so the domestic violence piece. This is a topic I've never covered before, but in a crazy way, it has served as, it sounds, and you can tell the story, but it has served kind of as fuel for you and the progress that you were able to make with hearing access and innovations and improving hearing accessibility. Although you've had a lot of progress there, you haven't seen the same level of success on the domestic violence side of things. Do you mind just walking me through what happened and how you have leveraged those experiences to drive the hearing innovation side of things, the hearing access and innovation side of things, but also while still trying to deal with the corruption on the domestic violence side?
Well, it's kind of bizarre, but I grew up with domestic violence. And so when I started to experience the domestic violence in my marriage, it was, quote, my normal. Okay. And it didn't seem as odd to me as if, let's say, my husband was a gambler. If he had started gambling, I would be able to easily say no. But for me, this was part of what I grew up with. And so it was my normal. And I was regularly called horrific names, including telling I was a worthless piece of curse word. Mm-hmm. And when you hear that all the time, one, you start to think that's your name, and it takes you down. And you think you could compartmentalize it, but it doesn't. It takes you down. And I always did feel like I was stupid. I also grew up with a learning disability and an undiagnosed learning disability that I didn't know I had. And so when you already feel stupid and someone tells you you're stupid, you believe you're stupid. But I didn't really understand it because I was supposed to skip to a second grade until my family moved. stupid people don't really skip grades.
No, I don't
And
think so.
right. And like, I never could really reconcile how I could skip for 2 grades, but be so stupid. And I didn't realize that my learning disability prevented me from memorizing things. But when you take all of that, I developed coping skills. And when I started working on the hearing access, I had an ex-husband who kept, in my ear saying, like, stop it, you're too pushy, you're too this, you're, a million words of what I was, and in his opinion. And I was like, no, I'm not. And I remember when the New York Times profiled me, and he said, oh, they captured you so well, in terms of being like this pushy mom who gets things done. And I was like, no. But then that's when this intervention that I mentioned to you, where suddenly I had 3 really respected people. I had Commissioner Saplin, Matthew Saplin. I had an installer, Fred Palm, and an assistant deputy director, Ted Finkelstein, intervene and say, like, you don't realize what you've accomplished. And suddenly, that was around the time People magazine honored me as a hero. My ex-husband had thought I was using my daughter as a monkey on an organ grinder, is what he told me. He didn't want me to do that story. And I went to a director of a major hearing loss organization and asked her opinion, like, was I? Because and she's like, what are you talking about? Like, this is great. So I did it, but like, you've got this constant chatter, it drove me, because in a sense, by breaking the silence for people with hearing loss, it allowed me to break the silence for domestic violence. I had 2 different lives, where I was this really successful person in one life, and this horrible, he now calls me an obstructionist, right? That's the words that he uses in legal papers now. I'm an obstructionist. And I'm constantly being faced with, like, these 2 people don't match, right? How can you be so successful and change hearing aids? Yes, I'm sure the hearing aid companies view me as an obstructionist. Anybody who doesn't like what I say views me as an obstructionist, because I don't tolerate conflicts of interest, lack of transparency, lack of accountability, and corruption. And so if you are on the side of that, I am an unbelievable obstructionist in life. But it definitely fueled my successes in some bizarre way. And people have always asked me, what is the secret sauce? Like, why have you accomplished so much? And I think it's from the domestic violence, if you can find a silver lining. And I always look for the silver lining in a problem. As I say, and I take Winston Churchill's, never waste a crisis.
No, you certainly haven't. There's something about when you're telling this story, I almost feel like you're yelling at yourself. It almost sounds like, I can't believe I didn't know I was smart. I can't believe I believed all that crap that I was told about my mind, or I was told, by my ex-husband, for example. I was living 2 lives, and it's almost like you're shouting at yourself saying, what, like shaking yourself into, why did you believe that? Is there any truth to what I just said? I don't know.
Likely. I will tell you, getting into Harvard last year rid any self-doubt about my intelligence level. That was a complete game changer. And probably I still get chills when I discuss, every time I tell someone, I still get chills up my spine about this, because it's hard for me to wrap my head around it. But there is. If I look to my younger self, why did I believe all of this? And I think it's because, you need to build around you a really good support network, which I have now. I have a team of 3 friends. I think you know them, Ruth Gauthier and Debbie Heiser. Yes, and there's another one, Susan Bernstone. And we've become this incredible support network of making sure no one takes one of us down in any respect, and builds each other up, and being just like a sounding board. And I'm not talking about like being yes people, but building this incredible, I used to hear about people having these board of advisors, and I always thought, we didn't get one of those. Like, is it on Amazon? Like, can I order it? And, the pandemic gave us this incredible opportunity through these Zoom groups to find this group of dynamic women who, they will say, no, don't do that. Like, it's just a great sounding board that speak from the heart and, have your best interest. And now I've decided I'm going to embrace the word obstructionist. I may make that my book title, the obstructionist, right? I've been listening to that word for so many years.
Well, you said before we started here, you talked a lot about things we accept and things we ignore. You had learned to accept something that wasn't right, maybe as a child, for example, where it just was normal. I mean, I used to get hit as a kid. I wouldn't say I was like assaulted, but there were times where I was hit a lot and it was normal. Was there any of you that thought, yeah, this is just what happens? The dad hits the mom, which, by the way, did not happen in my house. But I mean, was there any part of that you just thought, no, this is the way it is, and you didn't realize what you weren't saying and you didn't realize what you were ignoring?
I knew it wasn't right. Mine went beyond the traditional quote spankings. My father on one occasion pushed me down a flight of stairs, and I'm lucky. I just sprained my arm at the time, and I knew it wasn't right. And I was really lucky. I had a great friend at the time whose family allowed me to spend a lot of time at their home. I knew it wasn't right, but there are you couldn't talk about things like that in a certain upper middle class neighborhood. When I was married, I had a play group, and of the 4 women in the play group, it turns out 3 of us were abused.
Wow.
By our husbands. One was very open about it. She was the first model for Self magazine, Diane Erickson. And the other one, I don't know if she's publicly spoken about it, so I won't mention her name, but 3 of us were going through it. But because we kept it to ourselves and we didn't discuss it, it was a different time, it continued. And all 3, got divorced until Diane passed away. But I realized, like, the shame is projected on the person who's abused, and the silence only benefits the abuser. And I'm unwilling to take on that shame anymore. It is not who I am. It's not going to define me. I am going to use that to affect change and help people who have taken on, for whatever reason, the part of the domestic violence, it becomes more because there's a corruption within the courts, in my opinion, of benefiting people who are wealthy enough. And I've written about this, where if you're arrested for domestic violence, you suddenly file a divorce. And now in the state of New York, the Supreme New York, which is the lower court, is higher than the criminal court. And then that judge can overturn anything in the criminal court, which is what happened in my case. When my ex-husband was arrested a second time, and he ultimately accepted something called a German contemplation of dismissal, an ACD, for purportedly wielding a scissor at his daughter, the Supreme New York judge overturned the criminal order protection. And then, years later, I found out that his next attorney hired the judge. How can you hire a judge? We were before for 12 years. And then when you complain to the governor and you find out Governor Cuomo had his own sexual assault issues, of course he didn't care about this issue. And I confronted him at the Women's Equality event, and I believe it was filmed by 2 different cameramen. And he kept saying he would call me, and he never did. And I wrote letters, I wrote articles about it for Medium. And I was like, why is someone ignoring this? Why is it okay for any attorney to hire a judge where before and no one recused himself? And then you file a complaint with the Attorney Grievance Committee, and the Attorney Grievance Committee says, oh, she no longer represents him. And you're like, well, here it is in court documents saying she does. And I've seen her in the courtroom. Like, I'm not crazy, right? You're not going to gaslight me. That is just not going to happen. And so I used the success from the hearing access, right? Then going to the top, I went to the new governor's office. And now they're re-examining it. Now I don't know what the answer is going to be, but suddenly they claimed their computer system made an error. And it appeared she didn't represent him, and it was based on a computer system. Now, I don't know. I think it's the same computer system I use, because I think there's only one computer system, and it showed she did. So I'm a little confused by that. But let's see what happens. So I'm unwilling, and I will never stop. I will, like, no matter, I will get to this and I will publicize it. And it's part of why I'm going to the Kennedy School, because I am determined to shed light on what has basically become big business for attorneys in the state of New York and many other states. I mean, there was a movie called Divorce Corp about this issue in the state of California. Divorce is big business. Domestic violence is big business. A lot of attorneys are making money. That's not acceptable to me. And I'm not going to sit by. I'm not going to be their victim anymore.
You had to get to a point where you recognized this isn't right, and had the willingness came up with the courage to say something. So it took you a long time to finally say, that's it, I'm saying something. You know, even within the women's group, only one person was openly discussing it. I wonder if there was what was going on in your head? No, I don't talk about it. I'm not ready to talk about it. Or were you even separating your own experience with it as you were hearing your friend talk about it? What was going on in your mind?
Well, you know, it is interesting. I was going to finally tell her, and sadly, the day I was going to tell her, she announced she had breast cancer. And so that's the last thing I was going to discuss with her. But I did sit back and watch what happened to her. I remember she came home from having a mastectomy and finding out that her husband served her papers. Like, she comes home from the hospital and her husband served her papers. And I would hear stories of other women who went through these issues. Another one whose husband claimed she was always an alcoholic and she lost her child. And we didn't understand how this, quote, alcoholic was never drunk in front of anyone else. When you see things like that, and you hear about stories about experts, the same experts involved in every case, you realize, and there's no oversight on these, quote, experts, you realize it's impossible to stand up against them, because there's no one to complain to. What they do is they redirect you back to the judge to complain. Well, if in my case, like, the judge is ultimately hired by the ex-husband. So this was in my situation recently, where the judge appointed the receiver. The receiver sold our house to my ex-husband after 6 years and is billing $153,000 to sell a house to my ex-husband, which I don't really understand. And then my ex-husband's attorney hires the judge. Tell me how this circle exists. And I've gotten to the point where I'm going to speak about this, because you can't sell a house to, like, this just doesn't make sense.
Janice, you're a very determined person, clearly, and you're purpose driven, and it served you on with hearing access and innovations. On this side, it's a maddening story, because even somebody as determined as you is saying this is insanity, and no one is acknowledging it. And so how do you've got confidence, you've got a brain, you've been in business, you've got a law background as well, and it's still hard for you. How do you communicate with the person who's got none of that, who needs to say something, not only needs to say something, but has to be willing to follow through, with a system of insanity? How do you give someone the courage to not only speak up, but also follow through when at times it just seems like such dire odds? What are the odds? How do you do that?
I have to say on the on these conflicts of interest and the court system, I'm not sure because I haven't come to the end of it. I filed a petition online on this one particular judge. And it wasn't the fact that so many people signed the petition, because I find people sign anything, right? There's a core group of people who this is just what they do.
Yeah.
But it was the comments on the petition of other people before the judge. And so I tried to corral those comments by filing the petition, corralling the comments on the petition. The stories were over and over the same. And in my opinion, the state of New York needs to create an oversight board. And originally the Moreland Commission, which Governor Cuomo had implemented and then disbanded, where I testified. In fact, you can see me in a photo in the New Yorker sitting right behind the former US attorney, of Southern District. And it was I think there needs to be an oversight commission. We need people from the public who have no connection, who are overseeing what's going on and looking into and investigating repeated complaints about judges. They cannot operate anymore in this vacuum. And yes, we don't want to have I fully believe in the premise of we don't want to have people influencing judges. But then maybe we need to do forensic testing of judges to find out, are they corrupt? Put them through the same forensic testing they seem to put parents through for divorces, right? Suddenly you're a fine parent, you go through a divorce and now you're like crazy person. Maybe put judges through the same testing so they understand exactly what that testing is that they are ordering. But if they've never gone through it and they're ordering it, how do they know what they're testing? And set rates at the same pricing as court attorneys that work in the court. Like the receiver in my case, for example, is billing $800 an hour, which is insane. I am not a corporation. But if you have, let's say, I'm making up numbers. If a court attorney makes $150 an hour, and that's a made up number, I have no idea what it is in reality. But if that's what the state deems is the correct price to pay an attorney who works in the court, then anyone who is appointed by the court should work at the same exact rate. And if the state can't say no, $800 is right, well then pay your court attorneys $800 an hour. By having these caps on how much someone can bill, well, they bill up to that. I've never really understood when, if you could build up to 5%, of course, they're going to figure out ways to build. So what they do is they make motion after motion after motion because they have to figure out how to jack up their fees.
Just follow the money. It's crazy.
Well, I will tell you. So that's a very interesting thing that you just brought out, follow the money. So one of the people I helped with hearing aids was Bob Woodward. And Bob Woodward sent me an email after I discussed, recommended how he could get hearing aids and explain the whole market. He sent me an email saying, I used to say, follow the money. Now I say, follow the advice of Janice Lintz.
Domestic violence is a man-made thing. And addressing something like hearing loss might be easier because nobody's to blame for hearing loss. Whereas domestic violence and dealing with anything that has to do with somebody else needing to take responsibility is where I think we have problems, because you're trying to fight something that once you uncover one thing, somebody's going to have to admit to something, and then somebody else will have to admit to something. And all of a sudden they realize that everybody's got to admit to something. And is that really inherently why it is so hard to deal with this? Because a human being at some level is going to have to look in the mirror and say, I've got to take responsibility and admit that I did something that was shameful and embarrassing and disgusting. Is that really why this is so hard, or a possible reason why it's so hard? It's man-made.
A large part of it, because my ex-husband would have to admit that he abused me. I had emails where he's calling me every horrific name possible. I have a tape where he screamed at my daughter, mommy's not your mommy, mommy's going to die, in a decibel level that is unfathomable, right? And he denies, he's abused me. He has tapes. I have tapes where he is abusing me on the tape. Gaslighting, I never heard of that term until the last president. I didn't realize when someone denies something that is irrefutable on a tape, that's called gaslighting. I didn't really understand how this happened, right? If you have it taped, I was told I could have manipulated. The judge who his attorney ultimately hired told me I could have manipulated the tape. I was like, as if I had skill sets that would even know. I can't even like start my own podcast because I wouldn't even know where to begin, like on how to manipulate the tape, right? Like I don't have those level of skill set. So like that was unbelievable, but it is. The only thing I will say is hearing loss is not, people are not just born with hearing loss. It could be genetic, but we're seeing now 1 in 5 teens with some form of hearing loss from people putting things in their ears and turning up the volume. And I just want to clarify that. I do think that domestic violence has something to do with blame, but it's also money. There is big business. People who, look at Weinstein, look at Jeffries, look at all of these people who were involved, and there's a lot of money to be made. And it's just a perception of by some men, not all, of how women should be treated and what their place is. And then sadly, there are other women who, we saw this with Katie Couric, who's discussed how she didn't help women. And we don't know the extent of her not helping women, as the abuse with Matt Lauer was going on, what she knew and what she didn't know. We don't know, but she knows what she knew. Mm-hmm. And how do some women not help women? You play the feminist card to get a job or to get on the bench or whatever it is, and then you play along to get along. And so sometimes women could be their worst offenders of this. The judge in my case is a woman, right. And people will say, oh, we need more women on the bench. We don't need more women we need quality women on the bench. We need women who support women, who have a track history of raising up other women and not putting women down. And we all know people, right? Whether men or women, who there are people who support other people and others who find them are competitive.
How much is this cause undermined when somebody manipulates the system? There have been examples of women falsely accusing men and only to be found out that they falsely accused. How much does that undermine those that really were sexually harassed, really were abused, really were damaged? And does that water down your credibility, for example?
Yes, absolutely. And it's infuriating. It's absolutely infuriating when that comes out, because it's so selfish, right? It's so selfish. And I do believe in karma. I believe, you put out good in the world and it comes back to you, and karma comes back to people who do things like that. When you see especially famous people falsely accusing people and it comes out, it's exasperating, because it waters down. And then people wonder, are you part of that? And so then you feel this constant need to show evidence of, no, look at this, look at my evidence, right? Because you feel that no one believes you. Mm-hmm. And how do you disprove? If you're called an obstructionist and you're called all these things, a liar and everything, you need evidence. So you gather evidence, and it's just a horrible way to live, and it's a horrible system where people lie.
Is that why the legal system has maybe a responsibility to not respond or react too quickly, because they've got to guard against those that are manipulating the system?
The system is set up in a bad way. So, for example, I walked into a room where I didn't know I walked into the incorrect room. And I saw a judge who was on the bench sitting and discussing one of her cases that she had just finished with a select group of attorneys. And then someone turned and said, "Who are you?" She said, "You're in the wrong meeting." I said, "That's okay. This is really very interesting to me." She said, "No, you need to be on the committee." I said, "Oh, how do you get on the committee?" She said, "You have to be an attorney." I said, "No, I was on retirement status." So now you have the New York City bar president making decisions over who can sit in a room with a sitting judge to discuss a recent case. So now imagine you have another case and you go up against that judge, and that judge knows you just were in the room with her. So you're one of the bar president's besties. So yeah, it's really maddening. It's a system. It's a system, and really, domestic violence is just a talking point. It's really something politicians say, that when you approach them, they say they can't get involved because of the three branches of government. You have the judicial, the executive, and legislative, and one branch can't interfere. Well, if domestic violence immediately goes through the judicial, that means the executive and legislative branch could never get involved. I understand that in theory. Then why are you discussing domestic violence as part of your political platform to get elected? Because what are you exactly doing? Okay, you're going to enact another law. But if that judge, like in my case, never implemented the law, then what's the point of having more laws? And as I've said in my testimonies, we don't need more laws. We actually need them implemented.
Then you add COVID and the pandemic to it.
I just want to add one thing about this. What makes COVID bad, the positive is you're in your home, but it means there's no public in those court hearings.
Right.
It's just, and you're not allowed to, now the screen says you can't tape. Well, that means you have a very close thing. Nobody really knows what goes on. You just have the court reporter. But some of those court reporters don't take down, because if they don't take down something that the judge may have said inappropriately, because they want to make sure they're called back to that bench, and maybe their fees are overlooked, right? So you have that issue as well.
I'm concerned for all the people out there that want change for one reason or another in any part of their life and just quit. They give up. You use the term or the phrase, but a couple of weeks ago when we talked, people wear you out. Sometimes it feels like these systems are designed to make people give up. And if you don't have a true purpose or commitment or reason or why or whatever you want to call it, I think it's just easy for this stuff to always go unresolved. And I hope that I was able to help you connect these things in a thoughtful way. What advice would you give? Actually, let me ask you one more question here, Janice, then I'll give you the last word on it. You had told me that if you want to get something done, you have to address what matters, but you also talked about asking for what you want without being greedy. Do you want to expand on what those things mean?
I have been successful because what I ask for in the hearing loss world, I've not been successful in this domestic violence world, but in the hearing loss world, I ask for reasonable things that make sense, right? And also, when I work in an advocacy role, I am really clear I'm working in an advocacy role. There's no profiting. I keep my advocacy and my consulting very separate. I also, when I'm working on an advocacy, I won't even accept a free cookie from places, because I want to make sure it is really clear the intention. I mean, when I worked on a project with the New York Yankees and they offered me free tickets at the end, I declined them. I was recently offered free tickets for another stadium. I declined. I never ever take anything, because I want it very clear what my intent. If I'm as a consultant, yes, I'd love a cookie. Thank you. But I always want cookies, but not when I'm an advocate. I want to be authentic. And I think that authenticity has in many ways helped me with standing up at hearings on domestic violence. And it's really important to me I maintain that. They could take everything away from me. They can't take away my integrity. It's the one thing you can give away. And I'm not going to let someone take my integrity away.
What would you say to somebody who might be experiencing domestic violence? What advice would you give to somebody who isn't saying anything?
I would say, get out. I thought I couldn't. I really thought I could not leave. I was terrified to leave. I didn't know where to go. I didn't, going to a shelter was not realistic, because to me, they felt like prisons and they were unsafe, which is horrible. I think that is something that needs to be fixed. I just didn't know where to go. And I was afraid to go to the police, because if I went to the police, then I would be known, my children would be known as having a father who went to jail. And my kids have been very clear about that. There was another incident about a year ago, and one of my children didn't want to call the police because of that. And because he didn't want to be known as a person whose father went to jail. And that's a tough thing. And while I agree, disagree, I'm not sure I see both sides of it. It's a tough thing. And you got to get out there. It is so much better once you leave. And it's really hard in the beginning, like really, really hard. And if you think it's going to be hard, it's going to be harder than you think it is. But then there's this point where suddenly you cross over and you are like, my God, why did I endure it? I mean, I remember I moved from a 5-story townhouse to a 1-bedroom apartment, and I couldn't fit my things in, and I cried, and I was moved to a different part of New York City. And I remember thinking this was just so hard. But there's a certain point where you realize you've got it, right? I sold my stuff on eBay. I dramatically downsized. I reprioritized what was important to me. I figured out how to make it work. I slashed every expense. And I realized I was finally living the life I wanted to lead. I could go and I could travel. And the one thing we didn't discuss is I ended up taking 80 credit cards out and earning 2.7 million miles on credit cards. Now, what was crazy is I never had a credit card really in my name. I think I may have had a store card in my name, but our main credit card, I never had. I always had to get as an authorized user. And because why waste the money? And the card should be in his name, right? So I had no credit cards, and I went to suddenly I could get credit cards, and I took out a lot, and I used those points to travel. And suddenly I could pick the countries. I was never allowed to pick the country we went to. Suddenly I could pick the place. I could plan. And I realized that there was so much joy in that freedom, and that my passport literally became a passport to freedom. And so I ended up traveling, and I had this. It seemed horrible. And then suddenly it's like after rain, there's sunshine. And that's literally what happened.
It's such an amazing story. I would love to talk about it again, because I know that based on this, you know that there are other people out there living with this, maybe even unconsciously living with it. You know, they know it's happening, but they just can't say anything, don't say anything. And I commend you for working through it. I've never talked about this before. I really appreciate your time, Janice. If anybody wants to reach you, what's the best way for them to do it?
My 2 websites, JaniceLintz.com is my advocacy, and hearingaccess.com is my consulting. And then of course, LinkedIn, I'm under JaniceLintz.com. And, you know, I really recommend anyone who is in an abusive situation, tell your friends. And I remember thinking I couldn't, because that meant I had to do something. And yes, you have to do something. You have to leave. And it is so much better. And it will be hard, and harder than you even think it will be. But I highly recommend to people to do it, because I'm only sorry I didn't do it sooner.
Thank you, Janice. I appreciate it.
Thank you.